Jason froze as the man kicked the doghouse. Rex growled, muscles tense. "Doesn't look too sturdy," the man sneered. Jason knew they weren't real cops, and he was about to expose them in a way no one would forget. What happened next shocked the entire neighborhood. Jason Miller's Saturday morning started out like any other, peaceful, calm, and quiet. He was sitting on his back porch, sipping a cup of coffee as the morning sun cast a soft golden glow over his neatly trimmed lawn. His German shepherd, Rex, was running through the obstacle course Jason had built, weaving between cones, leaping over low barriers, and responding perfectly to Jason's hand signals. Rex wasn't just any dog. He was a retired K-9 officer, and Jason had turned his backyard into a private training facility to help other retired K-9s adjust to civilian life. It was his passion, and his way of giving back to the animals that had served their communities so faithfully. Just as Jason smiled at Rex's flawless performance, a loud knock at the front gate shattered the morning tranquility. Jason frowned, setting his coffee down. Rex immediately perked up, ears twitching toward the sound. Jason opened the gate and came face to face with two men in dark uniforms, wearing sunglasses and standing with their arms crossed. The taller one, a bulky man with a buzz cut, stepped forward. "Jason Miller?" the man said, his tone sharp. Jason narrowed his eyes. "Who's asking?" The shorter man, wiry with slicked back hair, flashed a badge. "Steve Jackson and Craig Miller, HOA Enforcement Division. You violated neighborhood code." Jason's brows furrowed. HOA Enforcement Division? Never heard of it. Steve held up a clipboard with a printed notice. "Unauthorized structure on your property. That doghouse needs to come down. You've got 24 hours to comply." Jason's gaze sharpened. "That's not a doghouse. It's a K-9 training facility, and it's city approved." "Doesn't matter," Craig said, smirking. "HOA rules override city ordinances." Jason's jaw tightened. He had dealt with plenty of cocky bureaucrats before, but these guys were different. There was a level of arrogance and smugness that set off alarms in his head. Before Jason could respond, Craig stepped past him and walked toward the doghouse. Rex's ears pinned back as Craig approached. Craig tapped his foot against the base of the structure. "Doesn't look too sturdy," he sneered. Then, with a sudden kick, he knocked the corner of the doghouse hard enough to make it shake. Rex growled low in his throat. Jason's fists curled at his sides. His pulse hammered in his ears. "Consider this a warning," Steve said, grinning. "Failure to comply means we'll handle it ourselves." Jason's gaze burned into them as they walked away, laughing. He knew two things for sure. They weren't real cops, and they had just made a very dangerous mistake. Jason sat at his desk later that evening, jaw tight and pulse still racing from the morning's confrontation. His hands hovered over his laptop keyboard as he dug into the so-called HOA Enforcement Division. He already knew something was off. Real police officers didn't act that way, and HOA board members didn't have the authority to enforce city codes, let alone hand out fines. Within minutes, his suspicions were confirmed. Steve Jackson and Craig Miller weren't legitimate HOA officers. They were just two HOA board members who had taken it upon themselves to become self-appointed enforcers. There was no actual HOA enforcement division. It was a title they had made up to give themselves a sense of authority. Worse, both men had a long history of questionable behavior. Steve had been accused of misappropriating HOA funds 2 years ago, but the case mysteriously disappeared before it reached court. Craig had been caught threatening homeowners with fines for things that weren't even in the HOA's bylaws, like the color of their shutters or the height of their fences. Jason's jaw tightened as he read through complaint after complaint. Most of the homeowners were too afraid to challenge Steve and Craig. Some had tried to bring it up at HOA meetings, but the complaints were always brushed aside. It was a coordinated effort to maintain control, through fear and intimidation. A knock on his door pulled Jason from his thoughts. He opened it to find his neighbor, Susan, standing there, looking uneasy. "They've done it before," she said, her voice low as she glanced over her shoulder. "2 months ago, they threatened to fine me $1,000 for having a potted plant too close to the walkway. Then last week, they sent a notice saying my garden gnome was a public safety hazard." She swallowed hard. "I didn't even put up a fight. They said they'd raise my monthly fees if I didn't comply. They let themselves into my backyard once," Susan added, "while I was at work. Said they were inspecting my property." She rubbed her arm. "I feel like a prisoner in my own home." Jason's eyes darkened. He knew exactly how this game worked. Fear was the weapon, and it had worked for Steve and Craig. Until now. Later that night, Jason sat on the floor of his garage, Rex sitting beside him. The dog's head rested on Jason's knee, his dark eyes alert and watchful. Jason ran his hand through Rex's fur, his jaw tightening. "No one threatens my dog," he said softly. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Captain Monroe?" Jason said as the line picked up. "I need a favor." Rex's ears perked up. Jason's eyes narrowed. This isn't going to end the way they think. The next day, Steve and Craig returned, this time with a crew. A flatbed truck with a crane pulled up, ready to dismantle the illegal structure. Craig held up a document. "Court order, signed by the HOA president." Jason stepped forward, calm but cold. "Where'd you get that order?" "That's not your concern." Craig smiled. "Oh, I think it is," Jason replied. Before Craig could respond, 4 black SUVs pulled up. 6 men in tactical gear stepped out, followed by Captain Monroe of the K-9 unit. "Gentlemen," Monroe said, removing his sunglasses, "this facility is under the jurisdiction of the city's K-9 division. That doghouse is not a structure. It's a certified training facility, protected under municipal code." Craig's smirk faded. "That can't be true. Monroe held up a hand. "It gets better." Jason handed Monroe a flash drive. "Surveillance footage," Jason said. "From my Ring camera. Shows Craig and Steve trespassing, threatening property damage, and impersonating police officers." Monroe turned toward Steve and Craig. "That's a felony." Steve paled. We were just enforcing HOA rules." Monroe nodded toward his men. "Arrest them." As the officers moved in, Craig tried to backpedal. "It's not a big deal." "Oh, it's a very big deal," Monroe cut in. "You two are looking at charges for impersonating an officer, harassment, and unlawful entry." Craig's face turned red as he was cuffed and loaded into the back of the SUV. Jason stood back, arms crossed, as Steve and Craig were driven away. "Come on, Rex," Jason said, giving his dog a pat. "Let's see if we can teach the new recruits a trick or two." 2 weeks later, the HOA held an emergency meeting. Craig and Steve had been removed from their positions. The fines issued by them were declared null and void, and the board was considering dissolving the HOA entirely. Jason stood at the back of the room, arms crossed, as the new president addressed the crowd. "We would like to thank Mr. Miller for bringing these violations to light. The K-9 facility is now protected under city ordinance, and we have invited Mr. Miller to oversee neighborhood security with his expertise." After the meeting, Susan approached Jason with a smile. "I don't think anyone's going to mess with you anymore." Jason smiled. "They'd better not. Rex takes security very seriously." Jason walked back toward his house, Rex trotting proudly at his side. Across the street, a "for sale" sign was being hammered into Steve's front yard. Jason smiled. "Justice," he murmured. "It's a beautiful thing."